It's Mark Rogers TV with our USC edition, bringing in Nick Dempsey from Conquest Chronicles to set up another chapter on our Rose Bowl coverage with USC taking on Penn State. The Trojans a 7-point favorite against the Big Ten champions. Nick, let's start right there because I know we're going to talk about Penn State's offense, and we did quite a bit before we came on tonight. But I'm trying to make sense of this line, and I would not be surprised if USC covered that point spread. I get the impression from watching these two teams that USC is the more talented team. Penn State has gone on for as impressive as the USC run has been, the Penn State run of 9 consecutive games, including a good Minnesota team, of course, the Ohio State marquee win, Wisconsin, and I'm missing someone, annihilation of a good Iowa team at home. The 9-game run by Penn State has been extremely impressive.
Yeah, they keep winning games. You got to remember, after September 24th or 30th, when they got clobbered by Michigan, people were ready to run their coach right out of the stadium. They didn't want him here. But then it didn't help that I think the week after he had an overtime win against Minnesota, and then the Ohio State game in October 100% saved his job for sure. But this run they're on, it's weird because in the first half of games, pretty consistently all season long, they've been bad, particularly on offense, like really bad. If you recall, even just in the Big Ten or the Big Ten championship game, they were down 28-7. I think they scored a late touchdown at the end of the half, and they gave up 3 points in the second half, I believe, to Wisconsin, and scored 24. So this is pretty consistent. They struggled early against Michigan State, came back to blow them out. We see this time and again. If as impressive as this run has been for them, it's been a lot of comebacks and sort of fluky plays. The Ohio State game was certainly one of those. If they could come out and play like they do in the second half of most of their games, if they did that for a full 60, this team would be incredibly scary. But as it stands now, I would not be surprised if USC had a pretty comfortable lead in the first half, at the end of the first half. Also would not be surprised if Penn State still managed to not only make it a game, but come back and win, because they repeated this process quite frequently all season.
So, Nick, outside of anybody who wears blue and white on a regular basis, you have probably watched more Penn State offensive football than anybody I can imagine in the last few days, trying to track this remarkable run. You mentioned that you caught most of the Minnesota game, and I mean on replay just in the last couple of days. Of course, the Ohio State shocker, the 24-21 win in Happy Valley that really sent things in motion and turned around the season, as you mentioned. The Iowa win, which didn't seem so impressive at the time. Then the Hawkeyes turn around and beat Michigan at home, and they knock off Nebraska 40-10. And, of course, then the Big Ten championship game against a very quality Wisconsin team that boasts one of the top 5 defenses in the country. I'll get you started by mentioning Trace McSorley's a guy who came into the Georgia game, the bowl game last year. Christian Hackenberger was the starter. He got hurt early in the game. McSorley looked awful for most of that game. Then he got things going in the fourth quarter. They were down 24-6, 24-3, something in that range. He put together 2 long drives against the Georgia Bulldogs, 75 80-yard drives, threw the ball extremely well, started to use his feet, started to do some of the things now that we've grown accustomed to seeing him do in the last 9 weeks. And they almost pulled that game out, and that proved to be invaluable experience against a quality opponent moving into 2016. So Trace McSorley, 25 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. What have you seen out of him in your tape review?
So everything comes down to they run a spread option type of offense, and everything really kind of hinges on the decisions Trace McSorley makes before the play as they're lining up and then during the play. So what they'll do is you'll see them run up to the line of scrimmage very quickly. So it almost looks like a hurry up. They force the defense to get into their formation. And then they'll check with the coach or make a pre-snap read, sort of limit the options down to what's going to work best. And then they'll snap the ball. They'll do their typical run pass option with Saquon Barkley that you've seen it a million times with the mesh point, and he can pull it and run, or he can give it to Barkley. If they give it to Barkley, Barkley's going to try to bounce it to the outside or maybe find a hole in the middle. If he pulls it, if McSorley pulls it, he decides to pull it, then he can either bootleg it out and run to the outside himself, and he's a very quality runner. I believe he's the team's second leading rusher. Or he can dump it off. He's got a cannon. He can throw it deep. Or they also bring in another wrinkle where they'll actually hold the receiver out on the edge, not actually run him out or block. But what they'll do is if McSorley runs to the outside, he can actually then decide to pitch it to the wide receiver, sort of like your traditional option style. So he's got the RPO. He can run it himself. He could pass. He can pitch to the receiver. So he's got 4 options just right there on every play. So and it's a lot of it's rhythm because you've got the other guys you've got to get in sync with, and a lot of it's learning to make the decisions, to see what the defense gives you and then respond accordingly. And if you'll notice, that probably explains why he struggled against Georgia at the outset and then came back and started doing really well. Their only 2 losses both came in September. After that Michigan and Minnesota game, things started to click for them, and they really got on fire. Now, what happens then is that defenses have to commit guys to containing the edge because the offense likes to get outside. So you've got to contain on the edges, and you've got to stop the run. And frequently then what will happen is in the second half is once you've got 8, 9 guys on the box, particularly playing the edge to try to contain the outside runs, that's when McSorley will start throwing it deep. And that's when great things really start happening for Penn State. They have these long passes that are high risk, high reward, but he keeps hitting them. And when you have that many weapons that you can throw at you deep, and now you force everybody into the box, and you've got man-on-man situations with the likes of Godwin and Gesicki, they can score a lot of points very quickly. So they've got a lot of options, but it's really all about Trace McSorley making good reads and good decisions. Saquon Barkley is a hell of a running back, don't get me wrong, but how many reps he gets, how many passes he gets, how many times he actually gets to run the ball, a lot of that falls on McSorley's shoulders and his decision making. So if you can get McSorley, if you can contain him, don't let him get to the outside, keep him in the pocket, or confuse him and force him into making bad decisions, you can stop this offense. But you've also got to get that second element where you've got to not get beat on deep passes, because they can turn around and just start chucking it 60, 70 yards down the field. And before you know it, you've given up, 24, 28 points, as poor Wisconsin has found out. So you've got to play the entire field. There's really no one on the defense that can make a mistake because they have an option to punish you for it.
Wisconsin's got one of the 5 best defenses in the country. Maybe not from a talent standpoint, maybe a top 15 to 20 defense from a talent standpoint, but they wrap up, they make the tackles, they're fundamentally sound, they read the keys, they do all the important things on defense, and as a defensive unit, they performed top 5 against very good offenses all season. They saw Michigan, they saw Ohio State, and Penn State tore them up in the second half. One of the big reasons why is because, as you saw on tape a number of games in the last few days, this Penn State receiving core, it was not bad a few years ago. And here's an example. Deshaun Hamilton's a kid that came into this program a few years ago, and he caught 82 passes for almost 1,000 yards his first season, and he's not a primary weapon right now. He saw 34 receptions this year and caught 1 touchdown. So we do see him. He's a complimentary guy, but they've gotten that much better that Deshaun Hamilton goes from almost 100 catches to 34 in a couple years. His counterpart on that Christian Hackenberg team a couple years ago, Geno Lewis, almost caught 100 balls for 1,000 yards. He's off to Oklahoma, where he's like their number 2 threat. And the guys that have taken over, Chris Godwin, who caught 50 balls for 795 and 9 touchdowns. So again, 50 receptions, not a ton, but big plays down the field. Mike Gesicki, the kid that you mentioned as well as tight end, he made a catch in the Big Ten championship game that you don't see a whole lot of tight ends making. He was on one-on-one coverage, and he was going down the seam. The ball wasn't thrown well. He contorted his body, twisted around, caught it, brought it in like one-handed. And so they have receiving threats that they go to. Hamilton, DeAndre Tompkins at 17 yards per catch as well. So McSorley's got weapons.
Yeah. And here's kind of the weird thing. This might seem a bit odd, but just in the number of receiving targets they have and the fact that they have a mobile quarterback who can also throw it deep, not the most accurate deep passer at times, but he can get it downfield and his receivers can make plays on it. But the number of receivers, mobile quarterback can get it out to him deep, very similar to a lot of Pac-12 offenses that USC is used to seeing. And so in that respect, USC is well prepared, because if you're going to play defense in the Pac-12, you have to have a solid nickel package. There's too many passing offenses. You have to be prepared. The difference here is that most of those Pac-12 offenses that you'd be playing nickel against, they don't have the running quarterback and Saquon Barkley RPO option up front. So it's gonna be interesting to see if USC can win the edge without having to commit extra guys to do so. Then they'll be able to run their nickel package and be better prepared for all these receiving threats. If they have to commit more guys to seal the edge and keep McSorley in the pocket, then you're going to get a lot of one-on-one situations without safety help, and then you're going to need a Dory Jackson to have a heck of a game. You're going to need a Biggie Marshall to not get beat or get relentlessly flagged for pass interference, which is, a pretty frequent occurrence for him a lot of times. So it's going to be a lot of this is going to come down to whether or not USC can run their nickel package and still stop the run. If they can do that, I think they'll be just fine. But whether or not they can contain the edges, that's going to be the question, I think, for USC.
Penn State entered 2015 with a bevy of running backs. They approached it as running back by committee, and it took them a few weeks to find Saquon Barkley. He ran for a little over 100 yards against some lesser opponents, and then really had his breakout game on national TV, a Saturday night game in Columbus against Ohio State. And despite Ohio State winning comfortably, burned the Buckeyes for 194 yards, and we know how good that defense was in 2015, and they flooded the NFL draft. You're a guy that spends your falls watching the likes of Christian McCaffrey and Ronald Jones on a regular basis. How does Saquon fit into that caliber of a back?
I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Saquon Barkley was the Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year. That's pretty impressive. You look at Rojo and you look at McCaffrey; those guys can make explosive things happen, and they can, they'll get on ESPN for the highlight plays and the 85-yard touchdown runs. Barkley, I don't think has that as much, but he's still got an amazing average. He's still a great workhorse candidate, running back. It helps the McSorley also gets plenty of carries, sort of takes that load off. But he's not the strongest power runner per se, but he can bounce off of initial hits, get to the outside, find a crease, and then explode. So he can make you pay for sure. But as far as Christian McCaffrey or Ronald Jones, I don't know if he's necessarily as explosive. I don't think he's as likely to get on SportsCenter top 10. But obviously you'll do very well with Saquon Barkley giving you, 20, 30 plus carries a game for sure. No problem there.
And the defensive line at USC, which turned out to be much better than either one of us anticipated, could be the big advantage in this football game, because Penn State, despite the explosion on offense, has issues up front. The offensive line's improved. It was a disaster 2 years ago. They actually went into the season opener having to move 2 defensive linemen. We're talking about the last season, the week of practice against Central Florida, to the offensive side. And then they protected a immobile quarterback, very talented, but Christian Hackenberg. So Trace McSorley's a wonderkin in this offense because he can mask the issues with the offensive line, as does Saquon Barkley. Those guys are still pretty important up front, and USC, I think, has a bit of an advantage there.
Yeah, there was one common theme that I saw, that when the Penn State offense was slowed down, wasn't just like the defensive ends containing on the edge. If you got pressure up the middle fast enough and got to McSorley or blew up the RPO with Barkley before they were able to bounce to the outside, you could shut them down. Michigan worked that to perfection when they blew them out. I mean, they were practically on McSorley by the time he had the ball in his hands. They were amazing at it. Ohio State actually did this really cool formation where they had 4 defensive ends on the field in one play. So they had guys that could get outside laterally, but could also blitz on the inside. And that worked really well in containing them. They would also back that up with 1 or sometimes even 2 players spying McSorley and Barkley, so that whatever options they had 2 spies. They would try to blow up on the inside, blow up the play from the inside, and then have 2 guys that would spy him if he got around the edge. So I really love that 4 defensive end formation. I don't know if USC can quite pull that off. I don't think they quite have the personnel for that. But if you're going to try to beat them up the middle, you have to beat them very quickly, because Clay Helton loves to talk about getting quarterbacks off their spot. In this case, that's not very helpful, because McSorley wants to get mobile. He wants to get to the outside. What you really want to do is either be able to contain him and keep him on his spot, or just knock him down and get the tackle before he's able to take off. But they're very weak in the middle, and if you're going to beat them in the middle, you got to beat them quickly. That's what it's going to come down to.
And when the red zone offense for Penn State bogs down, they're in pretty safe territory to at least get 3 out of it. Tyler Davis, 22 of 24 on his field goal attempts, although he did not attempt one from plus 50 yards. I don't know if that was the situation continually, but you would think after 12 games that most likely he's probably just extremely accurate from mid-range in, and doesn't necessarily have the big range, but still 12 of 24 for Tyler Davis and the Penn State offense. All right, it's Penn State USC. Of course, it's on January 2nd, and it's the granddaddy of them all, and we will break it down the next 2 weeks with Nick Dempsey from Conquest Chronicles. Nick, it's always a pleasure.
Absolutely, Mark. Anytime.